We live in an era where much of the past cannot be used to describe the future. The future is so murky that it's hard to plan for. And what matters most is the now. Jason Averbrook. Hey everybody, this is Matt Kutz. I'm your host of the Contextual Intelligence podcast, where we talk about my book, Contextual Intelligence, How Thinking in 3D Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity. And we are on episode 9. Episode 9 begins. Part 3 introduces and starts the conversation about three-dimensional thinking or 3D thinking. And it introduces the 3D thinking framework and the three aspects of time orientation that are so tied to how we relate to the world. And those three time orientations are hindsight, foresight, and insight. Hindsight is defined as accurately using past experiences to gain perspective on what is happening. It answers the question of why and is directly tied to leveraging experience and synchronicity. Foresight is future readiness and requires describing one's aspirational identity to gain clarity and answers the question of how, and is directly tied to embracing complexity. And then the last element is insight, and this is mindfulness of the present and answers the question of what, and is related to leveraging learning and tacit knowledge. Hindsight answers the why question, foresight answers the how question, and insight answers the what question. And then each one of those time orientations is related to the previous three podcasts where we talked about leveraging experience, leveraging complexity, and leveraging learning. And so you can begin to see the framework kind of fit together. And I will put the model in the show notes so that you can actually see a graphic representation of the 3D thinking model. And so that's what part 3 is about. And chapter 8 then leads us into the idea of thinking in 3D and then what exactly 3D thinking is. And what's really neat about this particular concept and this particular idea is how important it is when we actually make decisions and evaluate opportunities. So much of the 3D thinking framework relates to leadership. And I believe, and of course I have a biased opinion on this, but as you read the chapter, you'll see that there's many other scholars and researchers and authors who write on this as well. But there is a common thought that how we handle these three dimensions of time and how we use these three dimensions of time in our evaluation of opportunities, in our decision making, in our leadership behaviors actually has a pretty dramatic impact on our effectiveness. And one of the things I would say is so important that we understand and realize that if we fail to use all three time orientations, then we're failing to accurately use the resources we have at our disposal. And all of us understand intuitively how important it is that we use these three time orientations. But when it comes to the practical application and the usefulness of using the time orientations, we tend to overemphasize one time orientation over another. And this is where it gets interesting for us as leaders, because most leaders, especially inspirational, aspirational leaders, leaders who have a transformational mindset, tend to operate disproportionately in the foresight area. Those people, I include myself in that category, but those people who tend to overemphasize foresight are always thinking about the future. They're thinking about what's going to happen next, what we need to, where we need to be going. They're always asking and answering questions around vision, around purpose, around destiny, what we could be, what we can be, etc. And they have a vision of the future out there, which is so important for people in that position. The problem, of course, is disregarding the other two time orientations, hindsight, which is the accurate representation and remembering of the past and the useful application of our memories. And then also insight, which is also critically important to be able to leverage. And that insight is what's going on right now in real time. Sometimes where we want to be in the future, the foresight that we hold has an obstacle in its way, and that obstacle is always in the present. It's in the now, it's in the moment. And that's the insight. And failure or failing to see and recognize insight can be really catastrophic and really damaging to a leader's reputation and a leader's credibility if they are always focusing on foresight and failing the hindsight and insight spaces. So the person who really leads well and the person who performs well, and I'll even go so far as to say lives life well, needs to be able to integrate all three of these time orientations equally and not overemphasize one or underemphasize the other. So that's where the leader typically falls. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is the average person, the average Jane Doe or the average John Doe, they tend to overemphasize hindsight. And most people fall in this category. So even though we've kind of talked about where leaders fall, and if you've read any of my other stuff, I'm one that's very quick to say, I don't believe everybody is a leader. And that's a different podcast and a different conversation for a different day. But I believe the evidence is actually overwhelming that not everybody is a leader, despite what we say, despite what we read, despite what you're told that everybody is a leader. It's just simply not true. What is true, however, is everybody can practice leadership and everyone can develop leadership skills. But that's different than saying everybody is a leader in an ontological sense. But like I said, that's for a different day. That being said, most people aren't leaders. Therefore, most people have a tendency to overemphasize hindsight. And that's using our past as a filter through everything we're doing now. And I think that's kind of intuitive. I think that kind of makes sense. But one of the things that's critical for us to recognize is when there's tension in the workplace, tension in relationships, tension between the leader, follower, dyad, it's because we haven't integrated the third component, and that's context. And while leader and follower leader relationships are critical, those can't be properly understood outside of the context of time. And how we understand time, again, is hindsight, insight, and foresight. So when we add into the equation of leader, follower, leader, the third aspect of time, we get the 3D thinking framework dimension, which is hindsight, insight, and foresight, and how critical it is that we understand one party is generally coming from a hindsight dominant perspective. Another party is generally coming from a foresight dominant perspective. Both parties tend to ignore or forget about the insight perspective. And because of that, it generates tension in the workplace, tension between objectives, tension between goals, tension between what we should be spending our time doing, what's the best use of our time, what's the best use of our resources, and issues like that come up because we misappropriate this time orientation thing. So the solution to that is to begin to practice 3D thinking, right? And that, again, and I know I've said it many times now, but just to reiterate, it's the proper relationship between and the proper balance between the past, the present, and the future, or the proper proportion between hindsight, insight, and foresight. And the proper proportion is equal parts. So all of our decisions, all of our conversations, all of our memories, all of the opportunities we're evaluating, all of the behaviors that we evaluate need to be filtered through a proportional lens of hindsight, insight, and foresight. And we can't overemphasize one over the other. In fact, in her book, Driven by Time, author Peg Thomas points out that time orientation is a critical contributor to success or failure. And she states, and I quote, "Time matters to leaders. They worry about the past, present, and future, but most lean heavily in one direction, becoming past, present, or future oriented. This bias is associated with strengths that we can effectively use and weaknesses that hinder us. If we are aware of our time orientation or temporal alignment, we can begin to mind our time and grow attuned to the appropriate orientation for each situation, end quote. And I think that's really important, is she's drawing our attention to the fact that time is important. Time does matter. And we do have a tendency to be past, present, or future oriented. So I want you to just take a minute as you're listening to this podcast and maybe even pause it for a moment and just ask yourself, which am I more oriented towards, the past, the present, or the future? Which skill set, which concept do I lean more heavily on? The concept of hindsight, the concept of insight, or the concept of foresight? And then how has that worked for me? Because many times we develop an orientation or a preference for one of these time orientations because we see a track record of success behind using it. That's important. The real question I want to ask, though, is, does everybody else around you also see the same track record of success based on how you use your time orientation? Chances are they probably don't, or at the very least have a completely different perspective of an event that you think is foresight based, that they're thinking is hindsight based, or many times there's even things that we practice and do that we forgot about and we forget that it's hindsight based. This goes back to a previous podcast about tacit knowledge. And remember, we stated there that much of what we do, in fact, most of what we do, is based on tacit knowledge, which means I'm not really aware of, or I don't remember how I came to this conclusion, where I learned this information from, etc. And when that's the case, we also have to be very intentional and focused on developing a 3D perspective and a proper proportion between each of the time orientations. And when we look in the chapter, and again, we're talking about chapter 8 here on 3D thinking, we begin to see how hindsight and foresight can actually relate together to create insight. And the reason insight tends to be the lowest behavior, there's a lot of possible reasons behind that. And even in my own research, when you do the Contextual Intelligence profile, which is an assessment of the 12 CI behaviors as well as your dominant time orientation, we have found, or I have found over the years with thousands of data points at this point, that insight tends to be the least practiced time orientation. And I think there's a reason for that. And part of the reason is, again, like we've already said, because most people, if you're in the leadership sphere or space, you're foresight dominant. Everybody else tends to be hindsight dominant. But what we fail to recognize is when we're hindsight or foresight dominant, we tend to neglect this area of insight. And you need both hindsight and foresight to have insight. So someone who's foresight dominant lacks insight, not because they don't have insight, but because they don't have the hindsight necessary. And someone who's hindsight dominant doesn't not necessarily have insight. It's they lack the foresight to bring insight into the equation. So I actually have created a little equation here that I describe in the chapter, that hindsight plus foresight equals insight. Earlier in the chapter, when I'm introducing part 3, I actually have the continuum that you can kind of place yourself in one of these categories. If hindsight is on the horizontal axis and foresight is on the vertical axis, and you create a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being nothing, 10 being operates at a very high level, you can have a continuum of 0 to 10 foresight and a continuum of 0 to 10 hindsight. When I have both low hindsight and low foresight, insight is completely absent. When I have a high degree of hindsight and a high degree of foresight, I have a high level of insight, and strategic action then becomes very clear. People who have high degrees of foresight and high degrees of hindsight tend to be able to make decisions I won't say easily, but they're able to make decisions and they understand why they need to do something. And that's really important. So they have a very clear strategic action. So when they do make a decision and they understand and apply something that needs to be done right now, that's the present, they have a clear reason as to why. So that indicates clear strategic action because they're seeing the past clearly and they're seeing the present clearly. Insight gets skewed a little bit when we have a high degree of hindsight and a low degree of foresight. We tend to have this idea of biased insight because hindsight bias is a high risk. People who have high hindsight and low foresight, they tend to repeat the same mistake. So what they see in the present is a repeat of what was done. And we talked about this before, where we tend to see something that's new and novel. We try to force it into something that we've already seen, and we recreate reality to something that it's not because we want it to fit a model that we've already known and recognized. The other side of that equation, when we have a high degree of foresight and a low degree of insight, we also have biased insight. And that leads to a high randomness risk because we just assume things will remain as they are. So someone who has high foresight but low insight, they forget the fact of how much things have changed over time. And when we have that risk, again, we also have a biased insight in that we don't really know where we've come from on the journey to where we're going. And that's really, really important because we have to know where we've come from. So the person who has both a high degree of hindsight and a high degree of foresight can both articulate clearly where it is we've come from and where it is we're going. And when you can clearly articulate where it is you've come from and where it is you're going, strategic action becomes clear and insight becomes more obvious. Clarity begins to come more readily. And that's really, really important. And then when you finally have that, you begin to practice insight at a decent level, then you can have those three areas of hindsight, insight, and foresight converge, which is the perfect storm for contextually intelligent behavior. And ultimately, when we talk about contextually intelligent behavior, it is, in fact, bringing in foresight, hindsight, and insight into the equation, so to speak, when you're trying to make a decision. So the rest of chapter 8 kind of explains some of that. We get a lot more detail. This is one chapter that I actually have several graphs and charts in. The other neat thing about this chapter is it doesn't only describe each of these three areas, hindsight, insight, and foresight, but at the end of every section on each of these areas, I have a picture guide for you. And the picture guide is our question. So for example, I ask in the hindsight category, a really important question to ask yourself is, what experiences can you remember that have contributed to what you're doing today? And then I also have answer guides for each of these questions. Another question would be, what experiences have you had that bias you to new things? Foresight then talks about how important it is that we understand what we think we know. And when we talk about foresight, it's really critical to get into the four areas of knowing, right? So the four areas of knowing are known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. So you might have to pause and rewind and replay that again. But basically, those are the four areas of knowing. And foresight is more possible than we think it is. You know, we're not talking about predicting the future here. Foresight isn't that. Foresight is just being able to articulate where you want to be and how you're going to be there and articulate it with clarity. In order to do that, we always are evaluating things based on where they fall in each of those four knowing categories. But they should be relatively intuitive, especially the two bookends. Known knowns are the things I know and everybody else knows. Unknown unknowns, the other spectrum, are things that I don't know and nobody else knows. We didn't see it. We can't forecast that. We can't see it coming, but those things happen nonetheless. And then we've got known knowns, things I know, but other people don't. And then unknown knowns, things I don't know, but other people do. And in other words, I can get access to it. So when we're thinking about foresight, we have to be aware of which category we're working in. And that's really, really important. So some of the questions related to foresight then are, what can you do in the next 90 minutes to make you a better employee tomorrow? Then we get into the third aspect of this chapter, and that's insight. And the insight category is being in the moment, paying attention to the present is the best way to describe insight. And most of us dwell in the past or dwell in the future, and we're not really fully aware and fully present. But again, to fully be aware of the present, we have to accurately know the past and be able to accurately articulate the future. Once we can do those things, now I'm free to enjoy the moment, to perceive the moment, to rest in real time and actually see what's going on around me and how what happened is filtering that and how what I want to happen is filtering that. And I tell the story of Archimedes when he had his legendary or mythical, eureka moment, where he came up with this idea of buoyancy. The eureka moment, it was only possible when he was present and paying attention to what was happening in real time. But he couldn't have got to that or even had that moment of insight unless he first had all the years of experience that went into trying to explain the principle of buoyancy and what was going on there. And so that's really interesting. So you can get some more details on that. It's actually a really neat and fun story, which has a lot of application. One of the questions that we can ask from then the insight category is, what is your current assignment? And I mean that in two ways. One, you might have a work assignment, but then there's also assignments that you have as a calling, as a vocation. What are you called to do? So that's a really important question to be able to answer. And that kind of brings us to the end then of the chapter. And then I kind of conclude with the VUCA flip and how important it is for us to understand that when we practice these three areas of hindsight, insight, and foresight, it totally turns VUCA on its head. And when we talk about VUCA in the sense of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, we can now say it means vision, understanding, clarity, and alignment. And when we have hindsight in place, it helps us with our alignment. When we have foresight in place, it helps us with our vision. And when we have insight in place, it helps us with understanding and clarity. And that's one way we can flip VUCA to actually become beneficial to us when we practice 3D thinking. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. That was one of my more fun episodes to do. And we'll get an opportunity in future episodes to talk more about 3D thinking and particularly how Christmas ghosts, and now tell the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, kind of ties into this and how we can leverage that example in our own development of 3D thinking. And I like to ask, which Christmas ghost do you need a visit from the most, and which Christmas ghost is most frightening to you? And so that's one way to think about this, but that'll come in later episodes. In the meantime, if you want to get a copy of this book, I'd love to get it into your hands. I think it's a great resource for leaders. It's a great resource to help you in your performance and just living the best life that you can live. Again, the title is Contextual Intelligence, How Thinking in 3D Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity by yours truly, Dr. Matthew Kutz. You can get in touch with me through all the contact information in my website that's in the show notes, and I hope to hear from you soon. Have a great day.